Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 16 of the Ecce textbook, titled Why is Sext Such a Pest? This chapter is coming back to everything we've learned so far about nouns and adjectives, and specifically we're going to be coming back to noun-adjective agreement. So you want to hold on and keep clear in your mind all the endings we've learned so far in all three declensions, because you're going to need it in this chapter. To start though, let's look at the chapter 16 vocabulary. So the first word we want to look at is ludo ludere, which means to play in Latin. And in English, we get the derivatives of interlude and prelude. And again, you can tell by the spelling that they're coming from this root. Next, we have jocus, which is a joke. And again, that makes sense as the English derivative is joke. Huerto huertere means to turn. And in English, we get derivatives such as adverse, advertise, convert, controversy, diverse, and revert. So if you think of something as being, an advertisement, what it's trying to do is get you to turn towards it, which is the root of the word ad, mean toward, and wert, which is that turning word. So if you're advertising, you're trying to get your audience to turn and look at whatever your advertisement is. The same goes with revert. If you revert something, it means you turn again. You can almost think of it as turning around. You're kind of changing your mind or going back to something. Again, all 6 of these English derivatives are holding on to that root of turning in Latin. Animus means spirit in Latin, and in English we get the derivatives of animosity, magnanimous, unanimous, and animal. And again, if we think of that root of mind or spirit, it makes sense. An animal is something that can think on its own or has consciousness, or in other words, it has a mind. And if you say a group is unanimous, it means they're of one mind. They're all in agreement with each other. All 4 of these roots are holding on to that idea of your spirit or mind. Relinquo relinquere means to let go of something. And in English, we get relinquish, reliquary, relic, and dereliction. So if you think of relinquishing something, it's got almost the exact same spelling. It means you're letting something go. And a relic of the past is something that was let go, right? Something left behind. You can think of it that way. So again, all 4 are holding on to leaving something behind or letting go of something. Hospes means friend or guest in Latin. And in English, we get the derivatives of hospital and hospitality. So if you think of hospitality, it's how you treat a guest or a stranger or even a friend if, say, they come into your house. Scire means to know in Latin, and in English we get the derivative science, scientific, conscience, and conscious. And all 4 of these are talking about knowing. So for instance, for science and scientific, science is the study of knowing things or trying to understand or know things. So this is where that root comes from. Mortuus means dead in Latin. And in English, it would help you to think of a word like mortuary, which is where someone is taken when they're dead. Again, it's holding on to that root of death or specifically being dead. And if you think of the Romance languages, all 5 of them have a variation of this to mean dead as well. It's the same adjective and almost the exact same spelling. This brings us to the grammar for chapter 16. And again, we're going back to noun adjectives and agreement between them. So just a quick recap of noun-adjective agreement. You want to remember that in Latin, whenever you have an adjective modifying a noun, that adjective has to agree in 3 ways: case, number, and gender. Now that we've had a closer look at the declensions, you'll notice that they aren't part of that list. In other words, adjectives do not have to agree with the declension of their nouns. This is important because it means that a noun and an adjective that are in a pair might have slightly different endings, and we're going to see that in a second. So although declensions are not part of noun-adjective agreement, we still organize adjectives into declensions because they're sharing those endings for the cases. So in other words, we need a way of grouping them together. So we still use that term of declension for adjectives. So far, most of the adjectives we've seen have the exact same endings as the noun that they would go with in the first and second declension. So for instance, let's think of the word servus, which means slave. If you were trying to say the big slave, you would say magnus servus, right? The big slave. And you'll notice that Magnus, the adjective, has the exact same ending as the noun that it's going with, servus. The reason for this is because they're both in the nominative case, so they're sharing that US ending. Let's take another example of Ancilla, the slave woman. If you were trying to say the big slave woman or the large slave woman, you would say Magna Ancilla. And again, notice the endings. The same adjective, great or big, has switched to an A. The reason is because it's modifying the noun Ancilla, which is feminine. So it's sharing that first declension ending of the short A for the nominative singular, Magna Ancilla. And finally, we have baculum, which is a stick. And if you were trying to say the big stick, you would say magnum baculum. And notice the endings one more time. Now you have a UM, and the reason is because baculum is neuter, so you're using slightly different endings. But again, this is a second declension neuter, so we recognize that UM. So let's take a look. Again, all three of these examples have the exact same adjective. They're all sharing the word great or large, magnus. And you'll see that it's used with three different endings here, magnus, magna, magnum. And it's because of those genders. The first one is masculine, magna is feminine, and magnum is neuter. Because these adjectives are using the same endings as the first and second declension nouns, we call them first and second declension adjectives. And here you want to pay attention to that USAUM. This is how you'll always be able to quickly identify an adjective in your book as being first and second declension. It'll be listed out with these three endings. So if you need an example, look at the vocabulary for chapter 16. The word mortuus means dead. It's listed as mortuus, mortua, mortuum. That is telling you it's a first and second declension adjective. So always be on the lookout for these three endings to quickly identify them. So if we look at our chart that we've seen of noun endings, now we can use them for adjectives too. So this would be your chart for first and second declension adjectives. So whenever you're trying to use an adjective, all you have to do is match up the case, number, and gender. So we look to the left, here's our cases. You pick the number, meaning singular or plural, and finally you pick the gender. Once you have case, number, and gender, you can figure out the ending for any first and second declension adjective you come across. So here's a helpful hint. Whenever you're using a first and second declension adjective to modify a first or second declension noun, the ending will always be the exact same. And the reason for that is because first and second declension adjectives are borrowing or sharing the same endings as first and second declension nouns. So that's a good hint, because if you recognize a noun as being first or second declension, you already know what ending the adjective should have. It's the exact same as the noun. So far we've been talking about first and second declension nouns and adjectives, but what if we have a third declension noun? When you have a third declension noun, the ending between the noun and the adjective will not match up. So in other words, if you pair a first and second declension adjective with a third declension noun, they're going to have different endings. So let's take an example, Senatore Romano, meaning the Roman senator. You'll notice that the endings on these two words, even though they are a pair of noun and adjective, they don't match up. For Senatore, we have the short E, and for Romano, we have that long O. So how does this make any sense? Well, we have to come back to noun-adjective agreement to see how these match up. So again, the first thing we want to do is start with the case. For these, they're both ablative. In terms of number, they're both singular, and in terms of gender, they're both masculine. So they match up with all three pieces that we need for noun-adjective agreement. The only place that they don't match up is in the declensions. Senatore is a third declension noun, whereas Romano is a first or second declension adjective. The declensions don't match up, so they have different endings. Remember, declension doesn't matter when you're talking about noun-adjective agreement. It's only case, number, and gender that they have to agree. So just a quick recap. Adjectives always agree with nouns in case, number, and gender. Those are the big three we have to remember. First and second declension adjectives have the exact same endings when they're paired up with first or second declension nouns. And when you have a first and second declension adjective, it can modify a third declension noun, but it's going to have different endings. So don't get thrown off by that. It doesn't matter what declension the adjective belongs to, it can always modify any noun. We're only talking about case, number, and gender when we're talking about agreement.